Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the first day of the APS Virtual Symposium, The Promises and Pitfalls of Citizen Science. I'm so glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. This week's conference is inspired by the Society's 2021 exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist, and expands on the exhibition's themes by exploring understandings of citizen science over time, placing historical initiatives in conversation with present-day projects, as well as reflecting on the future needs and opportunities for the movement. Now, the exhibition itself is a virtual exhibition, and we will place in the chat box later in the talk a link if you want to go explore it yourself. For those joining for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library, museum collections, and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Now, we're using Zoom webinar today, so don't worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, you can type it at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. Now, as I said, you can type that whenever the question pops into your head, so don't be shy. We're going to leave about 15-20 minutes at the end of the panel for conversation. We also encourage you to keep the conversation going on APS social media using the hashtag CitSciAPS, CITSCIAPS. We'll also put that in the chat box. Papers from today's speakers are available for download from the conference website, and you can access them at any time, now, after the panel, using the passcode CitSci2021. And our speakers today will be giving sort of brief summaries of their papers. They're not going to be giving the entire paper, so there's lots more to read. We are very happy to be offering closed captioning for this conference. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box, again, on that bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It should be right to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the presenters for today's panel on the promise of citizen science. Now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three speakers at once. The speakers will then come up and give their papers, and then we're all going to come back together as a group for your questions. So our first speaker is Madeline DeDe-Panken, a PhD candidate in US history at the Graduate Center, CUNY. She is broadly interested in questions of gender, knowledge, and authority. Sitting at the intersection of science history and food history, her dissertation explores women's involvement in scientific and sustenance mushroom foraging as it relates to an American food fad at the turn of the 20th century. She's an instructor at Lehman College and has held fellowships at the New York Botanical Garden and the New York Historical Society Center for Women's History. Our second presenter is Susan Catwinkel, a professor of theater history at the College of Charleston. Much of her research is on American popular performance. Her most recent book is the co-edited volume, Performing Arts as High Impact Practice, published by Paul Grave. She has previously published a chapter on incubator baby shows in her book, Performing the Progressive Era, published by the University of Iowa Press, and is currently writing a chapter on them for a forthcoming anthology on freakery. Our third speaker is Michael P. Moore, an evolutionary biologist who studies why some organisms can adapt to a habitat better than others. He is currently a biodiversity postdoctoral fellow with the Living Earth Collaborative at Washington University in St. Louis. In his current studies, Dr. Moore is using citizen science observation of dragonflies to explore how warmer climates affect mating and reproduction. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Madeline for the first talk today.
Hello, can everyone see me? Okay, great. So thank you to APS for putting together this symposium, and I hope everyone caught the wonderfully thought-provoking keynote this morning, just a few hours ago. So my paper, which is kind of a encapsulation of my dissertation, explores non-professional involvement in mushroom foraging at the turn of the 20th century. It argues that through a remarkable mushroom fad, American laywomen carved out roles as and disseminators of mycological knowledge. Mycology is the study of mushrooms. And overall, it demonstrates how women's citizen science efforts survived into the professional era in unexpected ways while reflecting broader negotiations of gender authority and knowledge during this period. So before the 19th century, most Americans seldom ate mushrooms, which were generally shunned as mysterious, dangerous, inaccessible, and expensive, kind of the worst combination. A rare reference in an 1857 cookbook cautioned, quote, "The taste for mushrooms is an acquired one. It is best not to acquire it." So that changed beginning in the mid-1880s and really kind of dramatically in the 1890s when middle-class Americans alighted upon wild mushrooms as an attractive option for gastronomic and personal enrichment. And this appealed to a number of desires, enabling people to replicate new and fashionable foreign cuisine, especially French cuisine, at home cheaply, to get back to the land against a backdrop of intensifying urbanization and industrialization, and have a hearty and arguably equally nutritious meat alternative. So foraging especially played into the culture of domestic efficiency advocated by home economists and dietary reformers. With mushrooms, one could take advantage of a free delicacy sitting unused right outside the door, preventing wastefulness and saving money. But there was a hitch. With mushrooms' increasing popularity, anxiety about poisoning became more acute, or at least more vocal. And horror stories, as you can see here, abounded, even alongside rhetoric extolling mushrooms, demonstrating this kind of delicate balancing act between possibility and risk. And my research reveals fears that the cultural craving for mushrooms would end in disaster if inexpert women who were charged with culinary labor should rely on instinct, custom, or folklore. And scientific mycological knowledge was presented as the saving grace. Domestic authorities and botanists spearheaded an educational effort for mushroom identification and usage in periodicals, women's pages, home manuals, and cookbooks. Women authors encouraged readers to, like them, develop ID skills, go on gratifying excursions, and expand their culinary repertoire. In doing, they intermingled the gastronomic and the scientific, emphasizing systematic study and scholarly conventions like Latin names. So mushroom culture posited the kitchen as a laboratory. It situated botanical knowledge as appropriate and even essential for those charged with culinary labor. Proponents constantly warned against misinformation and false tests, imploring women to study only from approved by them sources. As part of the broader rise of science in this era, they advocated what they saw as modern, safe American foodways driven by scientific fact. They criticized alternate forms of knowledge in the process as antiquated and reckless behavior, and kind of in that process disregarded and denigrated traditional practices of immigrant and other marginalized communities, which I get into in my paper even more. But overall, these female mycological proponents, who were nearly all native born, white, and privileged, utilized their influence to promote a particular exclusionary kind of middle-class foraging that was based on domestic science tenets. And one of the questions that my paper raises is whether this rhetoric around poisoning and wastefulness may have been a strategic way into increasingly restricted botanical participation. The mushroom fad arose amidst professionalization and tethered to it masculinization. And the keynote this morning talked a little bit about that. So during mid-century, laywomen had eagerly engaged in culturally sanctioned botanizing that included collaboration with experts, and that was now precluded as those lines kind of hardened. And the growing population of women college graduates were often shuttled into low-level or uncredited positions. And mycology complicates this familiar narrative of exclusion and hard boundaries as a field that was uniquely receptive to the efforts of women enthusiasts. So mycology's domestic connotations, coupled with anxieties over poisoning, enabled select women to assert scientific expertise and belonging as citizen scientists, although it should be noted that as non-voters, their grip on citizenship was also tenuous during this period. But overall, this cultural endorsement served as impetus for and legitimization of expanded endeavors. By the mid-1890s, a population of women mycological experts had emerged, occupying this liminal space between amateur and professional. They claimed belonging in scientific conversations, even without degrees or formal employment. In addition to publishing in popular periodicals, they contributed to the field as collectors and illustrators and researchers, authors, and specialists. And this little known population engaged in scholarly self-expression, facilitated female intellectual networks, and really left enduring impacts on the field. One key site of female participation were mycological clubs, which sprang up in response to the fad, mostly in East Coast cities, as centers of study and camaraderie and foraging guidance. Women filled membership rosters and leadership positions, as in the New York Mycological Club, which was founded by a woman, Cornelia Bedford. And again, I talk about this more in my paper. But they helped shape club aims, scope, and activities, and used club's commitment to edibility guidance for the public to ensure space for themselves. In and beyond clubs, women's roles often included culinary responsibility, and you can see in that New York Mycological Club illustration, the chafing dish on one side and the microscope, what's it called? Yeah, on the other side. What was I gonna say? Sorry, I totally lost my place. So in and beyond clubs, women's roles often included culinary responsibilities, such as providing recipes and running cooking demonstrations. Safety, but also pleasure, was considered key for public interest and worth including in publications. So muddling these traditionally gendered tasks, mycological men either learned basic cookery or, more commonly, appealed to women to supplement and strengthen or even complete their work. So in this context, culinary labor was botanical labor, taking that logic of kitchen as laboratory one step further and raising questions about the definition of science. So as women's skills and contributions grew, some also stretched beyond culinary connotations, both for their own study and as part of educating other laywomen. In 1900, Among the Mushrooms, pictured here, stated its motivation as, quote, our craving for further knowledge. This marked a departure from women's original involvement because the authors decided they, quote, need not say anything on the uses of fungi as articles of food. So these were exertions of identification, description, and categorization, divorced from culinary and public safety aims. The same pattern followed in numerous other female authored guides meant for the enthusiast. And several women fashioned unpaid scientific careers beyond the culinary. Gertrude Burlingham, who's pictured here, earned a PhD and was considered an authority on Russula and several other lactarius as well. Violetta Delafield produced hundreds of striking and precise watercolors and 3 research papers. But gender norms still created impediments. So unable to gain mycological employment, Burlingham's full-time job as a high school biology teacher limited her pursuits, and Delafield's output dimmed following her marriage in 1904. Mostly, women's participation occurred in free time and blurry interstitial spaces between scholarly, domestic, masculine, feminine, and professional amateur. Overall, mycology provided an accessible venue for real lay participation, though. Women brought science into their daily lives and brought their knowledge and abilities to science. Their devotion to this subject was steadfast, and their labor was valuable, and their contributions, though largely unrecognized, were enduring. As they explored what their knowledge meant and how it could be utilized, these women evoked critical questions of what science is and who it might include. So while it might seem unexpected or even somewhat silly to focus so strongly on mushrooms, this particular lens offers a surprisingly rich view of how both women's roles and scientific boundaries were in flux during this period. Although the trend and its proponents are little remembered, mushroom culture offers a unique perspective on critical cultural negotiations. So from its vantage point, complex relationships between gender, authority, and popular foodways that were shaping American culture at the turn of the 20th century are brought to light. So thank you so much for listening. I go into a lot more detail in my paper, which you can read on the APS website, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I don't see myself, but am I on there? Okay.
We can see you. You're good.
Okay, great. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional and ancestral territory of the Wando and Etowah peoples, and that the College of Charleston was built at their expense and with the labor of enslaved people. These acknowledgements commit us to consistent and honest anti-racist work. Okay, next slide, please. Incubator baby shows in the US, 1897 to 1943. My topic is these incubator shows that were a phenomenon of the progressive era. There were hundreds of them across the nation in dime museums, traveling carnivals, and most commonly in amusement parks and on the midways of World's Fairs and expositions. The exhibits grew in popularity as the medical establishment's interest in the technology was waning. Incubator baby shows did life-saving work during those years and addressed some of the issues that made many physicians reluctant to use them. For the most part, these exhibits were managed and run by non-physicians, and it can be argued that it was their work that eventually convinced the medical community to embrace the use of incubators for premature infants. One note, for those of you who've seen the Society's virtual tour, you'll see that it focuses more on the distribution of scientific knowledge rather than on the science itself, and my paper follows that lead. So I'm discussing here the circulation of incubator knowledge through the shows rather than the technical evolution of the machine itself. I begin my paper with an example of how an 1898 dime museum show was advertised in Philadelphia. This early example illustrates most of the common characteristics of incubator exhibits, the amusement and commercial context of the exhibits, the emphasis on the scientific educational nature of the incubator, the reference to medical experts to bolster legitimacy, and the positive speculative language regarding the future of the infant on display. My paper looks at 3 promises and 3 pitfalls of incubator baby shows. The promises refer to the promise for public health. These 3 issues were roadblocks for most of the medical community and why, after initial excitement, most American physicians lost interest in the potential of the incubator. Incubator baby shows largely overcame these roadblocks and showed the general public the promise of incubators. The pitfalls refer to ethical issues that were endemic to incubator baby shows. Those ethical concerns have increased since the period of the shows. Okay, so the promise made by incubator shows. Incubator babies have promising futures. They will not be adult weaklings, as the eugenics concerned folks feared. Answering that eugenics prompted question by physicians, should these babies be saved at all? My paper provides some examples of physician reluctance and examples of advertising done by incubator exhibits to counter this question. Exhibit showmen focused a great deal on the brilliant futures these children would have, most commonly by becoming president of the United States. That featured frequently in advertising and articles about incubator babies. And these images show incubator graduates. Reunions were another device that we used to show the value of saving premature babies. The second promise of incubator shows, unlike hospitals, incubator shows were available to people of all races and economic circumstances, and parents were never charged a fee for the care of their child. Given the way that hospitals were funded at the time and the fact that widespread health insurance was still decades away, commercial enterprise may have been the only way that incubators could be used in a society as capitalist focused as the US. Of course, incubator shows took advantage of a diverse nursery and frequently advertised non-white babies to attract spectators. And one can assume that such ads also attracted a diverse audience. The third promise of incubator shows was that they worked. So this is related to, but different from the first promise. The first promise was that the assertion that premature and sick infants were worth saving. And this is the assertion that incubator technology could help save them. American physicians weren't convinced that they worked. And in hospitals, they often didn't, American hospitals, they often didn't for a variety of reasons, but they did work in the exhibits. Showmen knew that spectators wouldn't want to see a room full of dying babies, and so they touted impressive success statistics at every opportunity. It's difficult to say now how they arrived at their statistics or if they simply made them up, but there was little doubt to the public and eventually to physicians that incubators saved many infants who would have otherwise died. But as the showmen of incubator exhibits were addressing some of the ethical concerns about incubator use, they were creating others through their own behavior. These ethical issues, which arise from the conditions of the exhibits as a whole, not the machine itself, were somewhat acknowledged at the time, but appear even more problematic to us today. The first pitfall of incubator shows, the very issue about the ethics of exhibiting people. Incubator exhibits existed squarely within the world of the freak show. Many of the showmen who organized exhibits were sideshow managers, and despite their apparent wholesomeness, incubator babies were extraordinary bodies being exploited for profit. The images here show baby incubators advertised at dime museums alongside acts like Farina's troupe of trained rats and Harry S. Harrison, the human ostrich, which meant that he ate dangerous items like metal, glass, and knives. The second pitfall of incubator shows, the claim of medical expertise. In order to avoid censure and claim legitimacy, exhibitors didn't want to be seen in conflict with the medical establishment, so most showmen presented themselves as physicians, even though they were not. Fortunately, they generally recognized the need for skilled caregivers, so they employed physicians and nurses to oversee infant care and to sign paperwork for local arrangements. This image is of Martin CUNY, the most famous of incubator showmen, who led everyone to believe he had been medically licensed overseas. He had not, and I would suggest you read Dawn Raffles' excellent book on Martin CUNY. She was really the first to uncover the fact that he was not medically licensed. Other showmen used the title doctor when they were exhibiting incubator babies and not when they were exhibiting animals or managing performers, etc. Slide 9. The third pitfall of incubator shows, where the babies came from and where they went. Incubator showmen sometimes obtained infants from orphanages and baby farms when they didn't have enough infants brought to them by parents and physicians. When those infants got too big for the show, they offered them up for adoption or abandoned them back at orphanages. At the time, it was very easy in most states to adopt a baby, and shows sometimes just gave them away. Even when infants returned home to their parents, there was no follow-up care for infants, which obviously is problematic on its own. So conclusion, the promises of incubator shows convinced the public that premature babies were worth saving, could be saved by incubators, and they did it for all infants, no matter their origins. This awareness led the public to pressure hospitals to adopt incubator use and may have accelerated their acceptance by American physicians. But the pitfalls of incubator shows, incubator showmen participated in questionably unethical activities that exploited and possibly endangered infant lives. These failures were noted by concerned members of the public and may have delayed the acceptance of incubators by American physicians. There is no way to know if incubator shows accelerated or delayed the study, development, and use of incubators for the treatment of premature and sick infants in the United States. But this cultural phenomenon, and it really was huge, of the early 20th century is an excellent case study in the promises and pitfalls of citizen science. Thank you.
All right, great, thanks. And a big thanks to the APS for inviting me to be on this panel. Today, I'm going to talk to you specifically about the ways that citizen science is supercharging the study of evolutionary adaptation. So evolutionary adaptation is the process by which organisms become better matched to their habitats from one generation to the next. So briefly, the way that adaptation works is that within each generation, you'll have some individuals that are better at surviving and reproducing in their habitat than other individuals. And when those better matched individuals pass on their advantageous traits to the next generation, then after many generations, all that's left are the individuals with traits that are really well equipped to the demands of their environment. And so studying the causes and consequences of evolutionary adaptation is really important because we know it's responsible for much of the origin and maintenance of the Earth's biological diversity. However, dating all the way back to the mid-1800s, the search to understand how organisms evolve and adapt has typically required many years of study. So take Charles Darwin, for example. Beginning with his famous voyage on the Beagle, Darwin spent more than 5 years sailing around the world, collecting specimens and contemplating the origin and maintenance of biological diversity. But then what most people don't know is that after his trip, Darwin spent more than 20 years becoming an expert in barnacles and setting up little experiments in the back of his British estate. And ultimately, it took Darwin nearly 30 years until he had fully fleshed out the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is now sort of our foundation for understanding evolutionary adaptation. Even if we take a more modern example, however, we still find that deep insight into the workings of evolution can be a lengthy endeavor. So for instance, consider Peter and Rosemary Grant, two of the absolute pillars of modern day evolutionary biology. What the Grants did was study a small group of finches on a single island in the Galapagos for more than 40 years. And while their work tracking evolutionary changes in beak size from one generation to the next has provided many textbook examples of how adaptation works in the wild, it still took them nearly 4 decades to complete. But in this era of unprecedented global change, we don't always have the luxury of decades to do our work. Instead, in many cases, we need methods that will allow us to rapidly learn about previous adaptations so we can forecast it for the future. We need methods that will allow us to monitor organisms in real time so that we can see how they're responding to environmental change. And importantly, we need ethical approaches so we don't exacerbate existing problems in the field and in the world. Now, of course, citizen science projects will never replace every element of the research process, but in my paper and today, I want to tell you about 3 important ways that evolutionary biologists are turning to citizen science as a way to supercharge their research on evolutionary adaptation. So first, I'm going to talk to you about the role that citizen science can play in inspiring novel ideas about how evolution works. Then I'm going to talk to you about how important citizen science can be in getting enough replication to test fundamental evolutionary questions. And finally, I'm going to talk about how citizen science can be used for real-time monitoring of how organisms are responding to environmental change. So let's first begin by talking about how citizen science is being used to document patterns in the wild that inspire experiments in the development of new ideas. And as a case study, let's consider this great new project by Caitlin Rich and her colleagues. So they asked one of the big questions in evolution, which is what causes camouflage to evolve? And in general, we expect that camouflage should evolve so that animals match the background color of the habitat where they live. And this group of researchers wanted to examine this idea using the Monterey encentina, which is a salamander that produces a dark color form or morph, which you can see in the top picture, as well as these 2 kind of orangish morphs, which you can see below. And so what the researchers did was they first used citizen science photographs that were uploaded to the citizen science platform iNaturalist to identify what kinds of habitats each morph of this single species is most commonly found in across this really gigantic geographic area across California. And so using the patterns that they identified with the iNaturalist data, the researchers then subsequently designed experiments that used clay models that mimicked each of the 3 color morphs. And when they put out those clay models into each habitat that they observed in that giant iNaturalist data set, what they found is that each morph actually does not get attacked less in the habitat in which it should blend in best. So this is a totally novel finding inspired by citizen science data, and it suggests that our understanding of camouflage evolution perhaps needs some rethinking. Another exciting way that citizen science is being used in evolutionary biology is providing previously unimaginable amounts of replication of independent evolutionary events. So take this cool new study from Gunnar Oland and colleagues. So they asked one of the fundamental questions in all of biology, which is what causes one species to turn into 2 species or even more than that? And so they looked at this one species of fish that sometimes has these 2 forms, where one form is this giant that lives in the muck at the bottom of lakes, and other is sort of a dwarf that lives closer to the lake surface. And so what Oland and colleagues did was interview professional fishermen at 358 Scandinavian lakes about which of those lakes they tend to find both of the types versus just one of the type. And what they find is that the 2 morphs are more common and more distinct in lakes where there are these large predators that prevent one morph from moving between the habitats to interbreed with the other. And so what this really incredible amount of replication across all of these lakes allowed the researchers to see for the first time is that the risk of predation can actually force groups to stop interbreeding and start becoming separate species. And so one final way that I want to talk about that, that citizen science is sort of supercharging how we study evolutionary biology is by allowing us to watch how organisms are responding and adapting to environmental change in real time. So consider this study that I'm wrapping up now with some colleagues. So we were interested in how animals will adapt to global warming over the coming decades. And one potential way that scientists think animals might respond is by shrinking or completely losing their dark color patches, because we know that dark color tends to absorb light and can actually cause sort of cold-blooded animals to overheat. So what we did is we measured the size of these black wing patches, which I'm sorry, the image isn't showing up there, but we measured the size of the black wing patches on dragonflies from 2,700 iNaturalist observations and matched up those measurements to yearly sort of changes in temperature across the last 15 years. And what we found is that in the hottest years from 2005 to 2019, which are shown with these giant pink arrows, we find that the dragonflies had smaller wing patches when they were living in warmer years than they did when they lived in cool years. So this almost real-time monitoring of dragonflies allowed us to test and observe one way that animals might respond to warming climates over the coming decades. So I've talked about some of the advantages that citizen science is already offering to research into evolutionary adaptation. And the last thing that I want to briefly touch on are some of the considerable advantages that citizen science offers for more ethical research in the future. For instance, rather than institutional funding for researchers who travel to less affluent regions, do their research, and then leave, citizen science projects offer the potential for far greater coordination with local scientists in the regions that we study, as well as financial investment in the local communities in those regions. An emphasis on citizen science can also help us reduce sort of long distance travel and therefore hopefully curtail our individual carbon footprints. And finally, a commitment to citizen science can minimize the amount of contact that non-local scientists have with sensitive plants and animals without sort of paternalistically trying to tell local communities to stay out of environments that they've used and depended on for generations. So for at least these reasons, I think that a lot of evolutionary biologists like myself believe that citizen science holds incredible promise for supercharging how we'll study evolutionary adaptation in the coming decades. And so with that, I want to quickly thank the organizers of this great event again, as well as all of you for watching the overview of my conference paper today. Thanks.
Well, that was great. Thank you all so much. We're bringing our wonderful speakers back up. So the Q&A button is right down there on the bottom of your nav bar. Go ahead and ask questions at any point in time. I'm going to sort of get us going. I've scribbled down a ton of questions. I think it speaks a lot to just how generative these papers are. The first one I want to start with, it comes from a theme that I think Karen Cooper was really helping us think through in the keynote about sort of community-based science versus citizen science. For those of you who didn't get a chance to see the keynote, community science is science that is local, science that is often directed towards the empowerment of a group within a community. Now, what Dr. Cooper was saying is that one of the challenges is you can't really scale all the time from a community up to the larger, up to the sort of larger project. Although maybe Michael has an example here that could push back a little on that. And then citizen science is, and I think the definition she used was volunteer service to the sciences, right? This is somebody who's sort of working on behalf of a scientific project. So I want to open up first to all of our speakers. Where does the theme of community work for you? How much, maybe Madeline, yours is maybe the most obvious sort of community that's coming up. Susan, is there a community element involved in what you're seeing? And then of course, Michael, I'd love you to sort of tackle that question. I love how you get us with the sort of ethical questions about, maybe working with community, taking lessons from community science might be, help create a more ethical approach. But I'm curious if there are sort of limitations to that approach or that you see in any sort of way. So a long question, but I'm curious to hear your different opinions.
So I can jump in first, and thank you for that question. I was definitely thinking about that a lot with the keynote earlier. So the main population of women that I'm discussing, which are these, I call them mycologically inclined women who are predominantly privileged women and have ties to domestic science and domestic authority, are part of the citizen science project and also forming their own kind of communities around this and forcing the boundaries of citizen science outward into culinary spaces. But at the same time, there is real community-based knowledge being produced and shared in this moment by people who are not them around foraging and around fungi in particular. So there are populations of immigrants. So we're in this moment of rise of immigration. So you have all of these Italian immigrants, Russian immigrants, before 1882, Chinese immigrants coming over with their own traditions of foraging. And you have indigenous populations and marginalized folks and, African-American populations who were recently freed, who have foraging as part of their practices. So there's all of these practices going on that my main and I would argue that those are kind of community-based science practices that are going on that my main population of women are disregarding and denigrating through their claiming of space in this very particular way. So it's this whole network that I think is part of the community versus citizen science dichotomy, but also perhaps more complicated than that.
Just as a quick follow-up, there's a theme, and you'll see that in our Dr. Franklin Citizen Science exhibition. There's been a lot of focus on 18th century naturalists, for example, right? And the way in which they appropriate knowledge, often without giving credit, or with giving credit in a way that is, not really giving credit, right? It's sort of, I'm curious to the extent to which, with the sort of denial of that, the unwillingness to give expertise by your community, does that go back to a tenet of that sort of community's formation as middle-class white women? Does it come from above, from the scientists who they're providing this sort of, for those who are sort of encouraging them? I'm curious why do these patterns keep replicating themselves?
I think it's part of the larger progressive era reform movements, like in settlement houses and settings like that, where these women are in like doing similar projects of education for purposes of Americanization. And I think that it's part of that and part of the drive for science-based foodways that are coming from dietary reformers, but also the scientific establishment as well. Yeah, so it's both.
I'm curious, Susan, when you think about community in relation to your study, one might imagine that the showmen would actually be in competition with each other, although I don't know if they saw themselves as a community. But you give us this sort of tantalizing idea of maybe the community of those who survived as a result of being kept on incubators, right? And that sort of community of descendants, maybe. Do either? Is there an element in either?
No, interestingly enough, I mean, particularly given the time period, a lot of people didn't know what other people were doing, and I think the showmen did see each other in competition, although they clearly sort of stole some techniques from each other, and the medical community, which particularly at the time really communicated primarily through medical journals, stopped writing about incubators soon after the turn of the century, and it was really only sort of as the showmen were doing essentially research on airflow into incubators, the level of heat, particularly the type of feeding, how often infants should be disturbed or not disturbed, and it really, that information didn't get to the medical community except through like local doctors who they were working with, who would see that, and then eventually some of them started writing about it and doing these experiments also then in hospitals. So, but that took a while, and so it was sort of this. Physicians didn't really want to be known as being part of this community that was doing this, because it was sort of looked down on, and it took a few sort of brave souls to say, no, wait, there's actually stuff going on here, and writing about it. John Zahorsky, a physician, Dr. John Zahorsky, who worked with, he was brought into the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. He was intrigued by what was going on, and he started writing about it. And when he wrote about it, he particularly mentioned the shows. This is how they do it in shows, as opposed to this is how we're doing it in hospitals, and was quite disappointed that his work there was ignored for a lot of years. So yeah, I mean, the community was really the medical community, and they were very, they were big gatekeepers on this, and kept out the research for quite some time, until there were enough of them who kind of came around, and the public started pushing and holding fundraisers. They would hold fundraisers to buy incubators for hospitals.
Oh, wow.
And the public had been convinced by the shows. Yep. And then they're buying incubators for the hospitals, and so the hospitals have them, and they start using them and figuring out how to do it in ways that worked. It's an interesting sort of, it's an interesting back and forth between the medical community and the showman community, most of which who were not interested in each other at all.
Great, thank you. Michael, I'm sort of curious, are the lessons of community science being taken up as aggressively, or as much as you would hope? Are you seeing that in projects, or is that still maybe the aspiration, the ethical aspiration we're trying to get to?
It's a good question. I think at least the ways that these various kinds of citizen science sort of platforms are being integrated into sort of the work that I do and the work that my colleagues do, it's still really in its infancy. So it's perhaps not as well developed as it ought to be. I do think that the very presence of things like iNaturalist and eBird, which are really sort of important citizen science platforms where people can upload observations of different things that they've seen, is hopefully going to play a big role in democratizing sort of biological research moving forward into the future, because as the community of people that sort of participate in uploading observations sort of continues to increase, and I think iNaturalist is well over 25 million observations of plants and animals and fungi at this point. There's going to be sort of a wealth of data that's just out there for anyone to use whenever they want. And so my hope is that is going to limit the extent to which you're going to need to have credentials to be a part of this field going forward. But at this point, I think it's still too early to say anything definitive about the role that these various kinds of citizen science platforms might play in kind of leveling the playing field and decredentializing academic science going forward.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here from Ann Schultz for you, Michael. Do scientists primarily start projects on iNaturalist and invite citizens to gather data, or do they look at data already present? Are they sort of large data sets that one can sort of access and then think about, you talked about inspiration, think about the experiment they want to do from it?
Yeah, so I talk about this a little bit in my paper. So there's definitely both. So for some projects, there's absolutely a coordinated effort where scientists are working with local community members to sort of gather data and observations in the places where all of these folks live. And so I call that sort of coordinated approach.
Okay.
And there's some really awesome examples of these things. There's this paper there's this scientific article that just came out in one of the most prestigious journals in all of science a few weeks ago that relied entirely on these really large data sets of citizen scientists going out and observing butterflies. And they have a set protocol that they go and they follow. And so there's data on this going way back into the early 1900s. So there's absolutely sort of coordinated efforts and the truth is that those data sets aren't any different than if I was working with a lab and I had students that were working with me that were going out and collecting it. Now there's also sort of opportunistic kind of data sets. That's more what I have worked with, where people have already uploaded observations to iNaturalist or any kind of citizen science platform. And it's just sort of there for everyone to use. And it's not necessarily standardized, but there are ways to sort of deal with those kinds of things, sort of using applied statistics. And so that's more what I've worked on. And that I think is a big, because you can find things that you weren't necessarily looking for to start out with. That's a real, I think, wellspring of inspiration for a lot of scientists right now. And hopefully it will be a place where anyone, irrespective of whether they're sort of a professional scientist, whatever that means, where they can start to do their own research projects eventually as well.
That's great. So we have a nice question here from Adriana Link, who's our head of scholarly programs. And she asks, to what extent does all citizen science rely on some aspect of performance, either alongside fairs, in the case that you were sharing, Susan, or in gaining access to a community of scientific practitioners, in your case, Madeline? Is performance necessary, or does it help sort of facilitate these examples?
Well, in my case, performance takes the mode of needing to have this public buy-in in this very specific way, that there's this constant performance of the fear and anxiety that if this knowledge isn't thoroughly known, and right, if the study isn't in this particular way among this particular group of people, then the consequences could be dire, right? And so there's this real performative sense of the fear and anxiety of not doing participatory science, and relies on the public buy-in, and relies on the scientific establishment's buy-in that is a real, pressing issue, when it might not really be, right? Which is one of the questions that I bring up in my paper, because, certain mushrooms can absolutely be very dangerous, but overall, their danger seems so, intensely sometimes overstated, and particularly the sense that there are all these mushrooms just like everywhere outside the door going to waste all the time, and we have to go get them, or like they're just gonna sit there, and like you can't do your domestic duty efficiently without them, right? Like that also, there's this whole narrative that's being pushed that is a type of performance.
Well, I would say as a performance scholar, I would say it's always relevant and it's always important. Talking from my point of view, whether or not you're dealing with citizen science or professional science, I would say, because I mean, there are certainly, examples from history of science that was things that have been scientifically proven by the science community, but they didn't manage to sufficiently sell them to the public, and therefore things don't happen. We can just look at the history of the pandemic in the U.S. to point that your science has to be appropriately performed if you want people to accept it and make use of it.
I'm curious to sort of this is going from another question in the queue here. And this is, I'll confess, I'm an old American studies person. How much of your stories, Susan and Madeline, are about the progressive era? How much are they about America finding its way in a distinct sort of scientific, in a new scientific landscape? And how much do you see connections to Europe or other parts of the world and knowledge there? If any.
Well, for mine, it's definitely a phenomenon of the progressive era, which I wrote about in an earlier published article, and it's in that the incubator baby shows take advantage of the fascination with science and the belief that technology is going to make our lives better. That was so much part of the progressive era, and one of the huge benefits of incubator baby shows is that they were available to everybody, right? So it didn't matter. It didn't matter the child's race. It didn't matter their economic circumstances. They took everybody, and of course, they also exploited that because they used that to sell admission to the show. But incubators within shows were egalitarian in a way that they were not in the medical community, right? So hospitals didn't let people in if you were poor, and there were a lot of hospitals that didn't let people of color in, and a lot of people who did use incubators were wealthy enough to actually have one brought to their home. Then they would use it. So in the sense of the sort of growing awareness of the need for egalitarian, particularly healthcare in the progressive era, incubator baby shows were very much a part of that, and I think a product of a lot of the desires as well as the fears of the progressive era.
Thank you.
Yes, similarly in my paper, there's, it's part of this belief in science, this veneration of scientific expertise in the progressive era, but also about this moment in the progressive era where those issues are in flux, and gender relations, which are always in flux, were particularly contested in terms of women's education and women's space in public. And this is in, it's related to these reform movements toward scientific and rational eating and what it means to eat like an American and eat with rationality, which other great scholars have talked about, like Helen Zoe Veed and other people.
So a question, Michael, that I expect that you probably get when you talk about this is, and it goes off the early example you gave, more data is not necessarily the same as more time to think about data. And I'm curious, with the sort of increasing access to observations, what is the relationship to maybe the long-term development of expertise among scientists to be able to see sort of larger trends? Is that an issue still? I mean, or is that an earlier part of the sort of what we needed to get evolutionary theory to where it is now, for example?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I would disagree a little bit with the premise that having more data doesn't necessarily mean having more time. I think that that's generally true. Although in this is a citizen, what's exciting to me and a lot of other sort of professional biologists is that instead of us having to spend years or decades collecting large data sets ourselves, or our students driving all across the, at least for those of us that work in the United States, driving all across the country, there are people who are in those areas who are very excitedly taking up, taking observations and sharing those things with us. And so we're able to, rather than having to devote 2 or 3 years to get a project going, just to get some very preliminary kind of results to figure out what are the next things that we want to design experiments to test. We're able to bypass that by doing what we probably always should have done, which is leveraging the knowledge of the people in the communities that where they're actually working, and living. And so I guess that's one thing that's exciting to me about citizen and community science is that actually this might be a situation in which more data actually does mean more time for us to really think about sort of experiments that we want to design, as well as ways that we can synthesize the various lines of evidence.
We're fast coming up on time here on our panel. I got a text here from a friend, which it's a very specific question for Madeline, but I think, so my friend thinks a lot about mushrooms in terms of their psychedelic qualities. Is there an untold story here in your community where they've got, where any sort of go beyond the culinary into the hallucinatory? Is there an untold story there? Is that the sequel to your dissertation, maybe?
It's a question that I get a lot about psilocybin mushrooms and their kind of hallucinatory effects. So the real breakthrough of research on this came in the 1950s. I should say, like, of the white scientific establishment on this came in the 1950s when the Wassons went to Mexico. But there are bits and pieces of it in my work, but it's really not the focus or the main thrust. And even when those kind of effects are found in the literature in this era, it's part of the broader conversation around these organisms, not plants, although they're often called plants during this era in the literature, of the kind of mysteriousness and the danger and the anxiety around them. So not necessarily more interested. It's just kind of another form of how weird and, and odd these organisms are, which is why it's kind of, it's fun to study mushrooms and fungi as, an in-between plant and animal, kind of non-plant, non-animal organism, in the same way that the people I study were kind of in these interstitial spaces as well.
Well, my friend is
not really, unfortunately.
My friend is volunteering for any citizen science projects on psychedelic mushrooms. So
yeah, I will also say that now is a really great and fun time to be studying mushrooms because there's so much about them right now, both in terms of the psilocybin and becoming legal, but also a lot of interest in terms of their possibilities for sustainability. And you see them in fashion, sustainability all the time. And there's a few great books that have come out, and Take Up Lives by Merlin Sheldrake, and Fantastic Fungi has a documentary and a book. So there's a lot of interest right now in the potential of these organisms, and a sense that we know so little about them still, which is kind of analogous to the conversation that's going on in the 1880s and 1890s, starting in the 1880s and 1890s in my work.
So lots of promises here for the future of citizen science and for the knowledge that can be generated from it. A round of virtual applause for our three panelists for fantastic presentations. As we've said throughout, please download their papers if you didn't get a chance, and you'll get their full story. And I invite you to come back tomorrow, 1 p.m. For our panel 2, Historical Perspectives on Citizen Science. So thanks everyone, take care, see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.